series that we have been putting together to make available to our members and to also make basic information about Lincoln available to a larger population. Our speaker today, David Kent, this is his second presentation in this series. Last week, he talked about Lincoln as a politician. Today, he'll be talking about Lincoln as Commander-in-Chief. We also have with us today Ed Steers, who did the first presentation 3 weeks ago, and he talked about young Lincoln. Following this, next week, I will be doing the fourth in the series, talking about the Lincoln legacy. So I am the only member of this three-person panel who is not a scientist. Both David and Ed are scientists and historians and authors. And now I'll turn it over to David Kent, president of the Lincoln Group of the District of Columbia, to talk about Lincoln as Commander-in-Chief. David?
Okay, thanks, John. You should see my slides up now. So as John mentioned, I talked about Lincoln's as the political side of Lincoln's presidency a little bit at the end of last week. So today we're going to talk about what he was doing for the vast majority of time when he was president. He was focused in on being commander-in-chief during the Civil War. So before you can get an idea of how things went during the Civil War and how he was as commander-in-chief, you have to understand what the map looked like at the time. And I really like this map because it's really easy to see. You can see all of this blue are Union states, all of the yellow are Confederate states, and the greenish in the middle are the border states. A couple of things I'll point out and then tell you to forget for a second. Kansas is a Union state. Forget that for a second. I'll talk about it in a minute. West Virginia is sort of a border state, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So let's get started and just say, okay, what happens? You know, Lincoln gets elected in November of 1860, and he immediately, in South Carolina, decides that they're going to secede, and they start the process for seceding. 7 states end up seceding between December 20th and February 1st, 1861. And it's not hard to figure out which 7 states. It started with South Carolina, and then Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. All of the deep South states, the ones who are most dependent on slavery and on slave labor. These are some of the states like South Carolina and I think Mississippi. They're like 80-something% of their population are enslaved African Americans. So you can see why they wanted to protect slavery. It was the entire economy. And of course, they would be worried about, well, suddenly they become the minority and in a state where everybody had rights, there would be a problem there. None of this was a surprise. I mean, Lincoln had talked about the idea that the southern states were talking about seceding or going to war when he gave the Cooper Union speech earlier in 1860. And it was even talked about 2 years before. So it wasn't a surprise that all of this happened. So the 7 states secede. Kansas, and I mentioned Kansas. Here's this blue state sitting out there in the middle of nowhere. Kansas became a state January 30, end of January 1861. Well, the only reason Kansas became a state is because it was being held back from being a state by all of these slaveholding powers who wouldn't allow it to come in as a free state. So once 6 out of the 7 had left Congress, they were no longer in Congress, they couldn't vote against it. So Kansas came in the end of January. And we all talk about secession, but we don't talk much about the North actually got another free state. In the next thing that happens is Jefferson Davis has now been inaugurated as president of the Confederacy. This is in February. This is before Lincoln has even taken office. He's become, Jefferson Davis has been inaugurated the Confederacy down in Montgomery, Alabama. because remember, only the 7 Deep South states had left. That changes. So Lincoln finally gets inaugurated on March 4th, and the first day in office, he's handed some messages, and he said, you know, we have to deal with this Fort Sumter thing. You know, South Carolina is trying to capture and take over control of this federal fort at Fort Sumter, just like they had taken over other federal forts, and all across the South, they were taking over forts, federal installations. So Lincoln had to deal with this, and it went back and forth. There was a lot of discussion with the new cabinet. There was some controversy with Seward doing some things kind of behind Lincoln's back, maybe, and there was some miscommunication. And in the end, Lincoln said, okay, we're not going to give them weapons, but we'll send down food and water, and we'll send a letter to the governor of South Carolina saying, you know, that's all we're doing. We're not trying to start anything. We just want to make sure that they don't starve. Governor of South Carolina didn't like that idea, and certainly Jefferson Davis didn't like that idea, and he tells PGT Beauregard to go ahead and fire on the fort, which happens on April 12th, 1861. That's the beginning of the Civil War. Lincoln immediately says, we're not going to let this happen, and he calls for 75,000 militia, state militia. When he does that, the upper South states decide that they're going to secede. So now you're looking at Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas. They all secede and join the Confederacy after Lincoln calls up those 75,000 militia. 4 other states, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, these are all slave states. They decide not to join the Confederacy. And even though they are still slave states, and that becomes very important during the course of the war and very important to Lincoln's strategy. Now, I mentioned West Virginia. West Virginia doesn't exist at the beginning of the war. It's simply the western counties of Virginia. Virginia secedes, but in West Virginia, there's not a whole lot of slavery. They don't really want to secede. They're like, I want to stay with the Union. So they start a process that actually takes a while. It's a couple of years. They don't become their own state until June 20th of 1863. So usually when you talk about the border states, you don't talk about West Virginia. The other difference between West Virginia and the other border states is when it finally did come in, it did come in as a slave state technically because it was part of Virginia, but it immediately started passing laws to get rid of slavery since there was hardly any anyway in the western counties. And it really was a free state when it joined. So at the beginning of the war, there were actually 19 free states and 15 slave states. This is the main reason why the southern states decided against compromising. This is why they split the Democratic Party and split and allowed the Republican Party to win, which was almost a sure thing after they split, because they started realizing that no longer would they control Congress, no longer would they control the presidency. They were going to start losing out, especially if these territories started coming in as free states, that they would not have the numbers to maintain some sort of equity in order to protect slavery. So the only way they could protect slavery was to leave. So at the beginning of the war, there were actually 23 Union states, including the 4 border states, and only 11 Confederate states. And that becomes important, and other changes become important during the course of the war. I'm not going to focus too much on that, but those are important points. So let's talk about Lincoln. You know, why is he the commander-in-chief? And the main reason is because it's required by the Constitution. The Constitution says, in Article 2, Section 2 says, the president shall be commander-in-chief of the, trying to get rid of this so it's in the way. It'd be commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and of the militia of the several states when they are called into actual service of the United States. There's actually a little bit of, qualifiers in this one short little statement, but in a sense, the president, who is a non-military person, is now going to be commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy. And this is now Lincoln's position. So the first thing that you have to look at is, well, what is Lincoln's military experience? And first off, don't try to read this whole thing. It's not important. I'm going to summarize it a little bit. Lincoln, when he is in the House of Representatives, he starts to mock Lewis Cass, who is running for president as a Democrat against the Whig Zachary Taylor. And Lincoln is a Whig when he's in Congress in 1848. And Cass is being presented as a military hero for his time in the Black Hawk War. So Lincoln says, wait a second, I was in the Black Hawk War, so I must be a military hero. And he says, I certainly didn't break my sword. Apparently Cass had broken his sword. But if he saw any live fighting Indians, was more than I did. I didn't see any action. I did have a good many bloody struggles with the mosquitoes. And although I never fainted from loss of blood, I can truly say I was often very hungry. So he's mocking Cass, but he's also mocking himself and saying, if anybody tried to paint me as a military hero based on my Black Hawk War time, this is, that would be crazy. It would be laughable. And that's what they were drawing with Cass. So what was Lincoln's military experience again? Well, I mentioned last time that he did 3 months in the Black Hawk War, and the first month was as a captain, but he didn't know what he was doing. He didn't know the commands for getting his troops from one side of the fence to the other through the gate. So he just said, well, okay, fall out and, fall back in 5 minutes on the other side. That's as close as he got. That's it. That is no other military experience. He didn't see any action. He didn't really know what he was doing. And it was a short time when he was 23 years old, and that's it. So he doesn't have any military experience. So what does Lincoln do? He does what he always did. He borrows books from the Library of Congress. He actually borrows Henry Halleck's Elements of the Military Art and Science. Henry Halleck plays an important role during the war. Well, Lincoln starts studying up on strategy and how do you run a war? He didn't know, so he's looking it up. So he's trying to learn. He's going through a pretty steep learning curve, but he's like everything else. He picks these things up. But books aren't enough. He needs generals. So he picks experienced generals, or maybe not so experienced generals. Some of these generals were experienced. They had gone to West Point. They had military experience. Other generals are political generals. And this is because the Republicans were all on board with going to war, but the Democrats, not so much. They may have been unionists, which is why they split in the first place against the secessionists, Southern Democrats, but didn't have so much of a problem with slavery. So he had to get them on board. So some of these generals were picked just because they were politically helpful in order to get everybody in the North on board with this idea. So what is that? Let's talk about what he had to work with. What was Lincoln as commander-in-chief? What did he have to work with? So what's the status of the U.S. military? Well, there wasn't a whole lot of status for the U.S. military. The U.S. Army had a little over 1,000 officers and about 15,000 men. As far as an enlisted men, that's a very small number for a standing army, and that was on purpose. The various states, especially the slave-owning states, didn't want the federal government to have too much power, and they certainly didn't want the federal government to have too powerful a standing army. In large part, most of what they were thinking was states' rights, but a lot of it was states' rights to enslave people, and they were always worried about slavery, always worried about the free versus slave dynamic. So there wasn't a very large U.S. Army, but Lincoln did have, in theory, up to 3 million state militia that could be mobilized under the Constitution. This was a bit problematic in part because obviously all of those states in the South were not going to be sending state militia to help the Union. They, in fact, were mobilizing their own state militia for the Confederacy. That's not to say that there weren't Southerners who ended up joining the Union Army and fighting for the Union, or even Northerners who went down and fought for the South. But those, mainly in the South, they were going to fight for the Confederacy. And then in the North, there were a variety of views from the different states. Some of them were all in and they raised regiments very quickly. Others were a little slower and didn't provide as many men. All of these were volunteers raised by the states and sent to Washington to help with the military action. In the Navy, things were a little different, in part because the Navy had obviously had to have ships, so they had 1,300 officers, which seems like a lot of officers compared to the number of enlisted sailors. But that's not that big either. Most of the ships, so there were 42 of them, they were wood. They were all sail. Some of them had steam engines that had been put in. Mainly that was for maneuvering in the bays. They weren't very good for getting across the ocean, or you had to use sail. And not all of them were available. A lot of these ships, some of these ships at least, were off the coast of Africa in the African squadron, trying to deal with the illicit international slave trade. Some were in Asia. Some were sent down south. Some were in dry dock and under need of repair. Then you had the problem with, you had a lot of officers who resigned their commissions to join the Confederacy. About a quarter of the Army and the Navy officers left to join the Confederacy. And a lot of these were West Point graduates, very trained military people that left. There weren't that many enlisted men that left. In part because, unlike officers who had a commission who they could resign, enlisted men are enlisted for a set period of time. And if they leave, they're considered AWOL. So the numbers I say are less than 50. I think that's an undercount. And you certainly had people that went AWOL once things got started. Again, all at the beginning, these were volunteers. The other problem Lincoln had right away was that there was a substantial amount of treason in Buchanan's cabinet, in Congress, and in the military. The biggest example of this is Buchanan's Secretary of War, John Floyd, who was actively sending munitions and equipment, supplies to the South, was actively trying to send equipment elsewhere so that it couldn't be used by the Union to defend itself against this insurrection. It was actively making sure that the South would have what it needed as much as possible. In Congress, Jefferson Davis was a senator. He left and became the president of the Confederacy. Others were there and stayed long enough to kind of thwart the response. Remember, most of you probably know that between the election in November and Lincoln's inauguration in March, there was quite a bit, this intercession winter, was quite a bit of people trying to resolve this in Congress, offering different bills to try to say, well, we'll just come on back, all the people who seceded, come on back and we'll work it out. They're even willing to pass a constitutional amendment that says the federal government couldn't get rid of slavery. And yet none of that worked, in part because there were people inside, and Lincoln refers to this in his speeches later on, that were trying to thwart the idea. This is part of his second inaugural speech, in fact. And then as far as the military, you had many soldiers that left, including Robert E. Lee, who was a colonel in the U.S. Army for a long time. He was considered a very good soldier. And yet, in fact, he was even offered the general-in-chief of the Union Army and said, no, I left. I can't fight against my own state. So he ostensibly left to defend Virginia, but he really was only in Virginia for a couple of weeks before he became an officer in the Confederate Army. So all of these things were what Lincoln had to assess right away. Where are we? And they were not necessarily in a good place. So if you look again at the military and you start thinking about, what did you have to work with? Most soldiers at the very beginning of the war were issued something like a Springfield model 1842 smoothbore musket. This had a fairly long barrel, like 42 inches, a heavy shell, a 69 caliber shell. It was heavy, it weighed 10 pounds. It was a musket. So, everybody knows how a musket works. You have to stand it up. You stick in the, you stick in a shell, usually a paper cartridge with the gunpowder and the shell in there. You have to take this rod and tamp it down in there, all while you're standing up in kind of harm's way. Then you put a percussion cap here and you shoot. And if you're really, really good, you can shoot 2 or maybe 3 rounds in a minute, which is not that much. And each time in between, you have to, basically be standing up in harm's way to reload this. It had an effective range, maybe 100 to 300 yards. And that's it. Anything beyond 300 yards, you were lucky if you hit what you're aiming. So that was what was most being used at the beginning of the war. It's a musket. It's also a smoothbore, which means, it usually may be a round ball or something. It would go out there, and once it left the barrel, there wasn't a whole lot keeping it going in the direction that you wanted it to go. So they weren't that accurate. Once the war got started, they switched to this Springfield model 1861 rifled musket. So it still had all the problems of a musket with standing up and putting it in there. Still, you could only hit 2 or 3 shots per minute. It was a slightly shorter, but mainly it was about the same size, slightly smaller, and a mini ball. Mainly, the big difference, though, was that it was rifled. The barrel was rifled, which I'm sure everybody knows what that means, but just in case you don't, it's just a spiral groove inside the barrel. And when you use that in a mini ball, which isn't really a ball, it's more conical, like you think of a bullet, it spins it, and that spinning makes it go straighter and much further before it just starts to wobble around. So you did have a greater range, maybe 200 to 400 yards on that. And there were other weapons that were involved. There were many other brands of these things. It wasn't just the Springfield. There were others, but essentially, this is what most of the Army was using. And this particular model, Springfield 1861 rifled musket, was the standard. As far as the Navy goes, you're looking at ships, these wooden ships. This is one of the bigger ones with the USS Cumberland. The Cumberland was a huge sailing vessel. You can see along the base here, it had 54 guns. Most of them had to shoot out the side. So if you wanted to shoot at something, you had to turn your ship broadside to whatever you're firing at, which means your ship was broadside to whoever was firing back at you. And the Cumberland actually becomes pretty important in the Battle of Hampton Roads because it's the first vessel sunk by the CSS Virginia, which I'll talk about a little bit on the next slide. So this is what they had to work with. Now, there were some improvements, and Lincoln was instrumental in getting a lot of these improvements pushed through. This is supposed to be a depiction of a Spencer repeating rifle. So here we're no longer looking at a musket, we're looking at a rifle. So it's got the rifling inside, but it's a repeating rifle. And in this, you had a little cartridge that had 7 bullets in it that went into the stock, and then a lever to feed those bullets into the mechanism, and then you fire. So you could fire 7 bullets, certainly in way less than a minute. You could fire all of these things. These things weren't necessarily, embraced by the military, especially the Ordnance Chief Ripley, who didn't like all this newfangled, modern, improved stuff, because for a lot of reasons, but in part because if you can fire 7 shots really fast and you get a lot of green troops who are afraid, they don't know what they're doing, they're likely to just shoot off those 7 and waste a lot of ammunition. If you had a lot of different weapons with a lot of different types of ammunition that are very complicated, They're hard to get supplied. They're hard to keep ammunition for them. All of these logistical challenges. Lincoln, though, liked technology, so he kind of pushed these things, and he did kind of push some of them that were good and some of them that weren't. There were also things like carbines, which were much shorter rifles and that could be used, especially by the cavalry. There were what we might call machine guns, something called a coffee mill gun that could shoot a lot of bullets very fast. And later Gatling guns, which was much better than the coffee mill gun, but it didn't really get used until the end. They were bigger, more ungainly, and so they couldn't really, they couldn't carry them out into the field. They were much harder to use. But he was pushing these things, and some of them did get used. He also was instrumental in getting a reconciliation, in a sense, between John Erickson, who invented this monitor, this particular design of the monitor ironclad, and the US Navy. I won't go into it, but the Navy and Erickson had had a pretty bad falling out years before, and neither one of them liked the other one. But Lincoln said, you know, you have to have this, in part because I mentioned the Cumberland earlier and the Virginia. When the Virginia seceded, the state of Virginia seceded, the US Navy said, okay, we need to just burn the Gosport Navy Yard, which was located in Norfolk. And they did. They tried to burn all of the ships that were in there. One of them was something called the USS Merrimack. So when you hear a lot about the Battle of Hampton Roads, you hear about the Monitor and the Merrimack because it's more alliterative. The Merrimack was actually the Union ship, wooden sail ship that was burned. But as it burned, it sunk into the water, the hull, and the Confederates got the hull when they took over the Navy Yard, and they put ironcladding on it and renamed it the CSS Virginia. And it was this particular monitor that battled to a draw with the Virginia and saved the other two big ships, the Congress and the Minnesota, that were down in Hampton Roads. It was after the Cumberland had already been sunk. So Lincoln was instrumental in getting this put into place. There were also big improvements in the railroads. As I'll talk about in a minute, there were many more railroad lines in the north than there were in the south. But Lincoln was also a big fan of engineers like Herman Haupt, who helped build these what Lincoln would call beam poles and corn stalks and beam poles, because of this construction, which was remarkably strong to be able to handle these railroads crossing old bridges that had been knocked out. Balloons also came into play during the Civil War, and Lincoln he didn't so much push these balloons, but he did support them. Balloons were used only for a shorter period of time, from late 1861 into 1863, and they ended more for political reasons than anything else. But they weren't flying around, dropping bombs or anything. They were tethered. They were used for reconnaissance, and they also could have a telegraph line to send information down to the troops. And McClellan did use these in several cases. And finally, the telegraph, which had existed before the Civil War, but this was the first war in which telegraph really became used in warfare, especially because they're really, especially the Union, South as well, but especially the Union, got very good at figuring out ways to be able to string up these telegraph lines out in the field very quickly, close to the front lines, so that Lincoln could now use these to find out what was going on and use these to send orders. He was very much an active commander-in-chief, which was different from the way things had been in the past, because you didn't have that kind of instant communication like the telegraph allowed. So all of these things kind of changed the strategy, changed the way warfare worked. So Lincoln, again, is starting up, and he's, okay, what do we do? What's our strategy? And he relies on General Winfield Scott. Winfield Scott was a war hero from 1812. He was also a war hero from the Mexican War. He was so popular that he was the Whig presidential candidate in 1852. But by this time, he was about 70 years old. He's very overweight. He's got gout. He's not really, he can't get on a horse. He can't really go into the front lines. He's struggling. He really doesn't want to be there anymore. But Lincoln has nobody else he can turn to that has that kind of expertise. And Scott comes up with this idea called the Anaconda Plan. And effectively, it's we will blockade the coast, down the Atlantic coast through the Gulf, and then we'll work our way down the Mississippi. This will split the Confederacy in two. It allows us to control the coast so that they can't get reinforcements, they can't do business with Europe. And in fact, they spent a lot of time capturing coastal islands along the Atlantic coast and then into New Orleans and Mobile Bay and down the Mississippi. These were all strategies that were originated early on in the war. The problem was it wasn't very practical. As I mentioned, they didn't really have the manpower. They didn't have the ships. Half of the 42 ships I mentioned weren't available, and they just couldn't do it practically. And the Anaconda Plan actually wasn't what Scott called it or Lincoln called it. It was the name used by people who thought it was stupid, who were mocking it. But in the end, even though it didn't really happen right away, in the end, effectively, this is what happened. This is, we were able to blockade the coast, and they were able to move down the Mississippi, split them in two, work through these things. So this was kind of the first foray into strategy. But you know Lincoln, he's a strategic thinking kind of guy, and he was a lawyer. So he wants to know, well, what are our advantages? What are the North advantages? And he goes through and he starts thinking about all of this. He's absorbing all the information. He's listening to what everybody has to say. And he's like, okay, these are what North's advantages are. First off, we have 22 million people living in the North. There's only 5.5 million white people in the South, another 3.5 million enslaved Black people in the South, but the South isn't going to be arming them. So we've got a big a big advantage in population. We can use that. You then say, okay, well, we have a lot more manufacturing in the North. The North, in fact, had really put a lot of effort into developing an industrialization and manufacturing and ironworks. They also, because it was really, if anybody's from the North knows that agriculture is a problem. You can't put a huge swath of cotton fields in there because, number one, the growing season is very short. And number two, it's very rocky. I grew up in New England. You're not growing a lot of cotton in New England. So most of the agriculture in the North is food. In the South, very little manufacturing. They had rebelled against manufacturing in large part because it would cut into the plantation-based economy, that where a small number of plantation owners pretty much controlled all the economy and all the politics from the South. As far as acreage goes, agriculture in the South was mostly non-food. It could cotton, tobacco, and some places sugar. Now, sugar obviously is used in food, but most of this isn't feeding your army, and that's a big deal. Now, they also did grow food crops, but not to the extent that they're growing these non-food crops. So that's an advantage to the North. And you see during the war where the North is much better provisioned than the Southern soldiers. Also, the railroads in the North, to begin with, there were a lot more rail lines in the North. When you take the North itself, just the non-border states, the northern states that were not border states, there's about 20,000 railroad miles. Adding in the border states, it's almost another 2,000. So say 22,000 railroad miles in the North compared to only 9,000 in the South. And in the North, most of those railroads were interconnected. The idea in the North was we are going to move people around. We had all of those bigger population. We have more cities. we're going to move population around, and we're going to move commerce around, and we're going to move product around. So most of these railroads were interconnected and mostly the same gauge by the time of the Civil War, the gauge being the distance between the rails. The South, a lot fewer railroad tracks. There were a lot more mixed gauges. The states didn't agree with each other a lot. They didn't like to try to facilitate each other. The companies didn't like to work together. The companies in the North had some of the same problems, but not to the same extent as in the South. So there were a lot of mixed gauges. So you couldn't just take a rail car and just move it from one place to another and just change railroads, even change companies and stay on the same gauge. You had all sorts of problems. And also the railroads were designed to take cotton from the fields to the ports, not to move people around. And this again was on purpose. A lot of the plantation owners didn't like the idea of railroads, certainly not long distance railroads that went north, because they're always worried that their enslaved people were going to be escaping. Well, if you could hop a railroad and hightail it to Baltimore, so they didn't want that. So these are all North's advantages. And Lincoln looks at these things and says, okay, what are we going to do with all of this? Well, like any good lawyer, and Lincoln in particular, he's like, well, I can't just look at my advantages. I need to look at my opponent's advantages. Where are their advantages so that I can counter them? So he looks at the South's advantages. And first off, well, they're using forced slave labor for military support. And the North, enlisted soldiers had to do the support work. And by support work, I'm talking everything from, digging defensive ditches, building earthworks, bringing up all of the supplies in wagons, taking care of the mules and the oxen and the horses, cooking, building latrines. I mean, there's a lot of work. You think about the Army, you always think about soldiers, but there's a lot of non-soldiering, non-fighting work that has to go to support the Army. And the South was forcing slave labor to help with all of that support labor, which was done by soldiers in the North. So this big advantage in numbers wasn't quite the advantage that it was. The North still had an advantage, but not quite as big as it first looked like. In addition, interior lines are easier to defend. The South had interior lines. The North had to wage an offensive war over a large territory. Now, I have a map on the next slide that helps explain this. But basically, the South was sitting there in a defensive posture. They were sitting there where it's easy to kind of get your horses, circle your horses or something. The North had to attack in multiple places. You always have the advantage if you're on the defensive like that. And finally, the biggest advantage, the South didn't actually have to win. They weren't out to capture the northern states. They were just there to delay so that the northern public got tired of fighting. That the Northerners just said, why are we doing this? I'm losing my wife. I mean, my husband, my brother, my father. It's not worth it. Just let them go. I mean, take the slavery and let them go. We won't have slavery here. They'll have it. That's really the goal for the South. That's a big advantage. Whereas the North had to actually capture that land and capture the armies. So this leads to Lincoln's thinking, okay, what is my strategy? Well, how do we deal with this? And I have a couple of quotes that I think show this. First, this map shows that there's this Confederate offensive defensive, it says, to defend the South by an aggressive defense. You can see it's kind of, a little curve. Really, you're playing, that's the interior lines. You're saying, we don't need to go this way, we just need to defend this. The North, on the other hand, had to go down and attack the capital, had to go and go after all these armies all the way across through here, through Tennessee, through Arkansas, up through the coast. They had to do all of this blockade around the coastline. There was a lot that the North had to do. And so that takes a lot of men. So again, they did have a manpower advantage, but not the manpower advantage that really was needed in order to do it. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. So Lincoln has I pulled this quote from Lincoln that says that his idea is that we need to move at once upon the enemy's whole line so as to bring into action to our advantage our great superiority in numbers. We have more men. Obviously, with 22 million population, that doesn't, you're not going to include little children or women or older people, but proportionately, you have still a lot more than the South does. And he reiterates this in another quote. Says the general idea of this war is that we have the greater numbers and the enemy has the greater facility of concentrating forces upon points of collision. That's that interior line concept. Says we're going to fail unless we could find some way of making our advantage an overmatch to his advantage. And this can only be done by menacing him with superior forces at different points at the same time. We need to use that advantages, use our bigger numbers, hit them all over at the same time, and just keep them flailing. That was his thinking from the very beginning. Now, putting this into play, it takes time to take advantage, to put these advantages to force. The Confederacy almost won several times early on. I'll talk about one of those in a second. This is his policy, and he also pushed right early on. Our goal is to look at defeating the armies, not to capture Richmond. It's to go after the army that's defending Richmond. So you get into the beginning of the war in the first few months, and Lincoln has these 90-day recruits, these militia that have been called up, and he can only has them for 90 days because that's all he's allowed to call them up for. He can only call them up for 90 days until Congress comes back in session. Congress left town right after the inauguration, and they weren't due back until December. He calls them back into special session in July, but all that time between April, when Fort Sumter fell, and July, he's making all these decisions without there being a Congress there. So he's limited to these 90-day militia, and he's pushing. And at first he has Irvin McDowell as his leading general. Simon Cameron is the Secretary of War the first year. And both of them, Cameron and McDowell, are saying, Lincoln's pushing them, and they're saying, well, these troops aren't ready. We need to train them. I mean, they're all just these newbies. They're all green. And Lincoln says, you are green, it's true, but they are also green, the Confederacy. Says, you are all green alike. Says, if they can put together an army and they can amass at Manassas and they can fight, how come you can't? This is where Lincoln's lack of experience, military experience, especially the in the field logistical part of military, is really a big failing. He can study all he wants, the arts and science of military strategy, but without actually being in battle and being part of this logistics of running an army in the field, he's kind of doesn't understand that. So he's saying, they're green. Why can't you just attack? They're having the same problem as you are. Why can't you just keep going forward? It's not entirely true that they're all green alike. In fact, the Confederates had been preparing much longer than the Union had, at least since December, when the states started seceding. They were also, sending all, like I mentioned, Floyd was sending weapons and stuff down there. They were already taking over federal installations long before Lincoln was even inaugurated. They were also much better at using the old army, as a lot of these West Point people who went to the Confederacy, to train up the new army. And they very quickly got an army of 100,000 people. Lincoln still working with these people who are farmhands, and some of them are teenagers, that don't know anything about war. They're very, very green. So this isn't exactly true that they're all green alike, but still he's pushing McDowell to attack in a place called Manassas. And McDowell says, okay, I better attack. So at the first Battle of Bull Run, he does. He has 34,000 men. Beauregard, who you remember from Fort Sumter, only had 20,000. So McDowell had an advantage, but Beauregard gets to call up, gets reinforced by Joseph Johnston, who had 9,000, who ironically got them there by railroads. So the Confederates were actually the first ones to use railroads to their advantage. Beauregard also got help from General Thomas Jackson, who gained his name Stonewall Jackson at that battle, and Jeb Stuart. And what looked like a Union victory at first suddenly turned into a rout with everybody, all the Union soldiers running back willy-nilly for DC, along with a bunch of tourists who had gone out to have picnics and watch this fun little battle. Lincoln realized that this was, the strategy, needed some work, that he had to rethink things, and that this war was going to take a lot longer. He started to understand that you need a 3-to-1 advantage for the attacking force to guarantee that you would win any battle. Usually you need 3 times the number of attacking force as the defensive force. And he also needed a general. Okay, McDowell doesn't seem to be the general. So who does he get? And he finds George B. McClellan. Now, McClellan is an experienced general. He's won some minor skirmishes during this early months, nothing big, but he's won, which can't be said for McDowell. He's an experienced military man. He graduated West Point. He fought admirably in the Mexican War. And he also was one of 3 observers sent by the US Army to Crimea to watch the Crimean War and to learn military strategy. This guy, he knows, he's a military guy. He knows as much as anybody else. That's a good thing. He's also a Democrat. Now, he is not a political general. He's picked because he's a military guy and he's won these skirmishes, and Lincoln thinks that he's the right person. But Lincoln did have quite a few political generals, mainly to help get the Democrats on board for this war. And Lincoln sort of knows McClellan. McClellan had been in the Army, and then he had left. He was vice president of the Illinois Central Railroad in the 1850s, when Lincoln was doing a lot of legal work for the Illinois Central Railroad. He was on retainer for a while from the Illinois Central Railroad. Unfortunately for Lincoln, McClellan was a big promoter of Stephen A. Douglas. And in fact, it was McClellan who gave Douglas a special railroad car to move around Illinois in the 1858 Lincoln-Douglas debates. But still, McClellan seems like the right guy. And in fact, McClellan is great at training the troops. He takes these green troops and he works them into a fighting force. The problem is he didn't really use them for fighting. He was very slow to put them into action. He was always calling for more troops. He was always overestimating what the opponent always had, and he just wasn't moving. And Lincoln was pushing, and just like he had McDowell, he was pushing. He wanted to get him out there and fight this thing. Well, eventually, until January of 1862, McClellan's been laid up for weeks with typhoid, and Lincoln calls in McClellan's generals that report to him and says, okay, McClellan isn't going to use his army. If he's not going to use it, I would like to borrow it. Miraculously, the next day, McClellan is feeling a little better, and he shows up at the White House and he says, yeah, okay, don't worry, I've got all of this under control. And Lincoln starts telling him, you need to attack. He issues an executive order saying you need to attack by, I think it was Washington's birthday. McClellan says, yeah, okay, no. I have a better idea. And that better idea eventually turned into the Peninsula Campaign, which for a variety of reasons, both partially because of McClellan and partially because of bad weather, it didn't work out so well. But McClellan is in place. So Lincoln has got him in place. He's not that happy with him, but everything's going along, and he's got, okay, what are we going to do? Let me start talking about generals and chiefs. We need to have a general in chief because Scott isn't working out. He wants to retire. He's not even around anymore. He's up in New York near West Point. So he makes McClellan his general-in-chief. McClellan is general-in-chief from late 1860, late summer, September, whatever, of 1861, up through just after the elections in November of 1862. Lincoln has a lot of issues with him. Like I said, he was a great trainer, but not so good at putting those people into force. Lincoln complained that McClellan had the slows. McClellan was also arrogant and insubordinate. He would write letters home to his wife saying that, he could save the Union single-handedly if he just get rid of that gorilla in the White House, meaning Lincoln. He also had a lot of issues with Stanton. When Stanton came in January 1862 to replace Cameron as the Secretary of War, he had a lot of complaints about him too. So eventually Lincoln decides he needs to get rid of McClellan. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And he brings in as general-in-chief Henry Halleck. His nickname is Brains. He's the intellectual one. He's the guy who wrote the book, literally, The Elements of Art, of Military Art and Sciences. He is a pretty good strategist from a theoretical point of view. He's not as great as a field commander. And he ends up being there for quite a long time, actually, from late 1862 into the spring of 1864. Eventually, he's replaced as general-in-chief by Ulysses S. Grant. But before we get to Grant, during this time that Halleck is general-in-chief, Lincoln is effectively his own general-in-chief, for better or worse. Lincoln finally brings in Ulysses S. Grant. Halleck stays around. He's sort of a chief of staff to Grant. And he stays in Washington. Halleck is very good at communicating. Grant, not so much. But the tandem works out really well. And Grant travels with George Meade with the Army of Potomac, which I'll talk about on the next slide. Lincoln likes Grant, and I'll talk more about Grant in a minute. But that's just general-in-chief. You need to have a general for the Army of the Potomac. You need to have a commander. The Army of the Potomac is mostly in Virginia and dealing with Johnston and then Lee. And this is where some of the most important battles took place. Now, there certainly were a lot of other important armies, parts of the army. And there was a lot of moving around. But the Army of the Potomac was critical, was also what was defending Washington, D.C. So Lincoln brings in first, he has Irving McDowell. And as I already mentioned, McDowell falls out of favor after the fiasco at First Bull Run, and he's out of there. He stays in the Army and he does other things, but he's no longer commander of Army of the Potomac. And he brings in McClellan, who is now serving double duty. He's the general-in-chief and he's the commander of the Army of the Potomac. Some of the problems that I think McClellan had was because he was trying to do two different things. The Army of the Potomac is looking at, this is what I'm going to do and fight these battles. The general-in-chief is trying to look at all the other armies all around the country at that point and trying to direct what they do and keeping track of what they do. I'm not saying he was just overextended and that's why he had problems, because he had a lot of problems that had nothing to do with being overextended, but it didn't help. So after Lincoln gets rid of McClellan as general-in-chief and our Army of the Potomac, he's out both jobs. He says, I need to have somebody who's head of the Army of the Potomac. I have Halleck now in general-in-chief. I need somebody who's head of the Army of the Potomac. And he thinks, I think Joseph Hooker would be the right person. But Halleck and others say, well, no, not Hooker. Burnside. Burnside's your best guy. And Burnside is probably best known by everybody for his facial hair more than his military exploits, because General Burnside's sideburns are the talk of the town still today. Burnside also is known for some of his mistakes more than his successes. There is a Burnside Bridge at Antietam for those who go to Antietam, but he's also known for the crater in Fredericksburg. And, I'll talk about those in a minute. So Burnside's in there for a little bit, but in 1863 is replaced. Now Lincoln gets rid of him and he resigns, and Lincoln puts in Hooker finally. Lincoln has some issues with Hooker right away, and he writes them in a letter, and I'm going to talk about that letter next. So Hooker is there for a very short time, 1863. June 28th of 1863, now Hooker is out of there, and George Meade is the commander of the Army of the Potomac. Now, I mentioned June 28th, 1863, because how many days is there between June 28th, 1863 and July 1st, 1863, which is the beginning of the three-day battle at Gettysburg? So you have to give a lot of credit to George Meade for showing up and really getting this trial by fire, throwing him in right from the beginning and say, okay, here's your command of the Army of the Potomac, go chase Lee. So let me talk about this letter to Hooker that Lincoln writes. So first off, don't try to read this. I'm going to paraphrase it. He puts Hooker in place in January of 1863, and he says, of course, I've done this for what appear to be sufficient reasons, but I have some issues with you that I want to tell you about. So first off, so he starts to praise him. I believe you're a brave and skillful soldier, which is good. You do not mix politics with your profession, which is good. You have confidence in yourself, which is good. You're ambitious, which within reasons does more good than harm. But when you were reporting to Burnside, you did a grave wrong to the country and to a meritorious and honorable brother officer. Hooker was backstabbing Burnside. He got other people up against Burnside. He was not being a good soldier. So Lincoln is telling him, says, it's obviously, I didn't like this. He says, on top of that, I've heard that you think that the army and the government need a dictator. He says, obviously it's not because of this that I'm making you head of Army of Potomac, but in spite of it. So it's only those generals who gain successes can set up dictators. What I now ask of you is military success, and I'll risk the dictatorship. It says, we're going to support you, but watch your back. You've been backstabbing. What do you think your officers are going to do? That said, beware of rashness. And here he's referring to Burnside. Burnside in December of 1862, which is why he's no longer head of the Army of the Potomac, repeatedly sent futile assaults in Fredericksburg up the hill against impenetrable position. Send the first wave, they get wiped out, sends another wave, gets wiped out, sends a third wave, gets wiped out. This is not how you win a battle. Burnside had some issues. Later, he would have some issues with the crater. So he takes them out and he said, beware of rashness to Hooker, but with energy and vigilance, go forward and give us victories. He was always pushing these generals, we need victories. And he's not so confident that they're going to do it. So let's look at the next issue. Maybe I mentioned George Meade. So George Meade is, Hooker is out of there now, and he's made George Meade. He's the head of the Army of the Potomac, just days before Gettysburg. He takes his army, follows Lee, gets up to Gettysburg. They fight for 3 days, and it's a decisive Union victory for Meade. This is great. Meade has done a great job. Lee then hightails it back through Maryland, over the Potomac, and down to Virginia, except it's been raining. The Potomac is flooded. It's can't get across for several days. And Meade chases him for a while, but then he takes this time and doesn't attack. And it's really bad weather. It's raining constantly, but the river is slowly going down. And Lee finally gets across the river and escapes. To make matters worse, Meade reports back that he has successfully, quote, driven the enemy from our soil, unquote. And Lincoln is livid. It's like, what are you talking about? Driven the enemy from our soil? The whole country is our soil. Says you had a chance to capture him and you didn't. Meade hears about this, offers to resign, and Lincoln says, so okay, writes him a letter. Lincoln wrote a lot of letters. So he writes this letter. Again, don't try to read the whole thing. I'll paraphrase. Says, I've just seen your dispatch to Halleck saying that you want to resign because you heard I wasn't happy. Because first off, I am very, very grateful to you for this magnificent success you gave in the cause of our country at Gettysburg. So I'm sorry to be a pain to you, but I was in such deep distress that I had to voice my feeling. Then he has a long section in the middle where he talks about everything that happened with Lee, what Lee was doing, why he was stuck there for a while, what Grant and Meade was doing, and Couch and Smith, and what they were all doing and why they didn't attack. And he says, he's very much still in the weeds here. Then at the end, he writes, I do not believe you appreciate the magnitude of the misfortune involved in Lee's escape. He was within your easy grasp, and to have closed upon him would, in connection with our other late successes, have ended the war. The other late successes, he's referring to Vicksburg, which Grant had taken on July 4th, right after Gettysburg. So, Lincoln is telling him, I'm just totally blown out that you didn't go after him. And because of this, you could have ended the war, but because you didn't go after him, the war will be prolonged indefinitely. Now, this is July of 1863. The war's got almost 2 more years to go now. So he's thinking this could have been ended now, and it didn't. Then he thinks about this, and he ends up sticking it in an envelope, sticking it in his desk, writes, to General Meade, never sent or signed. He never sends this. Now, he does get word back to Meade through Halleck that, he's basically a job. I can afford to just throw people away just because I get ticked off for one thing. And maybe he had some reasons. And there's a lot of people debated whether or not Meade could have captured Lee or not. The weather was really lousy and a lot of other reasons. So he decides he's not going to send this and he's going to keep Meade around. That's a really good thing. And Lincoln is learning. He's maybe slow, but he's learning. Let me talk about one other thing. It's a little bit of an aside, but it's very important at this point, is that Lincoln also had to think about the United States colored troops, because there's one other part that happens in the midst of all of this. After January 1st of 1863, the Army is able to enlist African Americans into the military because of the Emancipation Proclamation. Cameron had been pushing in his first year when he was the Secretary of War, he had been pushing to enlist African Americans right away. Lincoln was hesitant to do that for 2 reasons. One is that it would have actually violated the law, since there was a Militia Act of 1793 that said that only free white males could be in the military. He did get that law changed, or Congress changed that law in July of 1862. And remember, Lincoln by this time was already scoping out the Emancipation Proclamation. So I'm sure he had talked to his buddies in the Congress and said, maybe you should change that law. But in any case, the other problem that Lincoln had was there was a big question about whether white troops would continue to fight if they were fighting with Black troops. And Lincoln spent all of his, this is part of the strategy as commander-in-chief. This is a war to save the Union, not to end slavery. You could get all the Democrats, you could get all of these people on board for saving the Union. It was a little harder for if you made the cause ending slavery. And in fact, after the Emancipation Proclamation, you lost a lot of white soldiers who didn't want to fight to free the slaves. But in any case, African Americans did come in. There were a lot of them. There were almost 180,000 in the Army. about 20,000 in the Navy, which actually had started much earlier because different rules for the Navy. And they fought valiantly in many, many battles and proved their worth. And not only, and obviously they're motivated. They're not only fighting to save the Union, but they're fighting to get their own freedom. And some of these were men who had escaped from the South. So that was part of Lincoln's strategy coming into the second part of the war. He also had to find, at this point, he needs to look for new generals. He's like, McClellan's not working out. All these other people are not working out. I'm doing my own general-in-chief. I need to find some people who can take this stuff on. So he finally finds Ulysses S. Grant, and he makes Grant general-in-chief, recreates the lieutenant general rank that George Washington had had that nobody had had since. Grant had had many successes in the Western Theater. He had captured Vicksburg, which was a very difficult task to do. He had a lot of losses. He lost a lot of men because he was very much about, keep pushing to try to win. He lost a lot of men. Some people complained that he was a butcher. You could argue that Robert E. Lee actually lost more men from his command than Ulysses S. Grant did. So, maybe butcher wasn't quite the right thing, but Lincoln was rebutted those and he says, I can't lose that man, he fights, because that was his biggest problem. He didn't think these other generals were putting enough effort into winning this war. Grant comes in and he essentially brings in William Tecumseh Sherman. Sherman had been around, of course, just like Grant had from the beginning of the war. And Sherman, just like Grant, had a lot of people who thought he shouldn't be around. In fact, some people thought he was crazy, a bit of a nervous breakdown early on. But Grant says, I trust this guy, and I trust him to do the things that I think are right, which are both in agreement with what Lincoln thinks are right. And Sherman takes over the Western Theater. He has obviously the March to the Sea, capturing Atlanta in September of 1864. Pretty much changed the tone of the presidential election in 1864 and went from Lincoln thinking he wasn't going to win to winning fairly easily. And then he gives, Savannah, Georgia to Lincoln as a Christmas present in 1864. So these two men, really made a big difference. There's a third man of this, a bit of a triumvirate, and he's the man with the best hat in the Civil War. And this is Philip Sheridan. Sheridan was given charge of the Shenandoah Valley, which had been kind of used by the South as a conveyor belt, to get up to Washington, the attacks on Antietam and Gettysburg and at Fort Stevens, Finally, Grant, by the time he's in charge, puts Sheridan in charge of the Shenandoah Valley, and he says, just do what Sherman is doing in the March to the Sea and just make sure these guys can't get up here again. And they do that. On top of this, Meade is still the head of the Army of Potomac, even though Ulysses S. Grant is traveling with him. So Meade is still in command of the Army. General Grant is obviously an influence on what happens with the Army because he's there, but he's the general-in-chief. Halleck is still in DC as sort of a chief of staff to Grant and communicating, and Lincoln finally has the team that he needs, that he can count on. So I think a lot of this is shown in some letters that I'm gonna share with you to various people. So in July of 1863, Lincoln writes to Grant. This is in July 13th, so it's soon after Grant has won Vicksburg, which was July 4th. It says, my dear General, I do not remember that you and I have ever met personally, which is true. They hadn't met at this point. So as I write this now is a grateful acknowledgement for the almost inestimable service you have done for the country. So Vicksburg in particular, but also the other areas, Donaldson and those places that he had won in the West. It says one more thing. It says, when you reached the vicinity of Vicksburg, I thought you should do, and what you finally did, march the troops across the neck, run the batteries. He gets into the weeds here still. He's still watching. He's still looking at the details. But he says, when you got below, though, and I thought you should go downriver to join General Banks, who was in New Orleans. But when you turn northward, I thought it was a mistake. I now wish to make the personal acknowledgement that you were right and I was wrong. So this shows that Lincoln is still looking at details. He's still very much involved with what happens in the field, keeping track of it. But he's also starting to realize that, hey, I've got somebody that I think knows more than I do. And he's working towards the same goals and he has the same basic philosophy. I need to start staying out of his way. And, he admits he's wrong, which is not something that presidents do very often. Another letter he sends to Grant in April of 1864. This is after he has made Grant lieutenant general and has made him the general-in-chief. He writes to Grant and he says, not expecting to see you again before the spring campaign, because during the winter, the weather was so bad that a lot of the military just pretty much shut down. Says, I wish to express my entire satisfaction with what you had done up to this time, so far as I understand it. Says the particulars of your plans I neither know or seek to know. He's now somebody who is saying, you know what? I don't even need to know what you're going to do because I have confidence that you're going to do the right thing. Says you are vigilant, self-reliant, and I'm pleased with this, and I am not going to get in your way. This is quite different from his relationship with earlier generals. Says, obviously, I don't want to see any great disaster. Granted, certainly knew what disasters were. I mean, he was involved in what happened at the drawing a blank. Anyway, what happened, and that didn't work out so well. So he knows that Grant is cognizant of all of these things. So he said, certainly ask me if there's anything I need to do. Otherwise, go forward and win. Says yours very truly. This is April of 1864. There's another year left in the war, but he's already showing confidence. Later, now in August of that year, he sends a telegram to Grant at City Point. He says, I have seen your dispatch expressing your unwillingness to break your hold where you are. This is Grant had told Lincoln that I was unable to capture Lee and end this war at Petersburg. And he's settling in for what is going to be a very long siege. And this is August, and Petersburg doesn't end until early April of 1865, the end of the war. So this is the beginning of a long siege. He says, I'm going to stick to this, though, and I'm not going to let him get up. Lincoln writes back and tells him, neither am I willing for you to break your hold. So hold on with a bulldog grip and chew and choke as much as possible. He's almost like, the rah-rah team now. He's a cheerleader for Grant more than giving him orders or directing him what to do, because he knows Grant is going to do what Lincoln wants him to do, which is keep fighting, keep at them, use our superior forces in multiple places at the same time. Do everything that you can to keep pressure on them. And I think this really gets shown in the last slide that I have here. Lincoln now in April of 1865, the very end is April 7th. He's sitting down in City Point. He's down there on kind of a vacation, and he's going to get away from the pressures of DC. He's down visiting Grant. He's down there for a couple of weeks, and Grant is actually off now chasing Lee around Petersburg. And Lincoln is down there, and he knows that Grant's there, and he's sitting in City Point, and he reads this telegram that comes in from Philip Sheridan to Grant. And Sheridan is saying, I've just captured Buell and a bunch of other people. This is what I've been doing. And, we've caught all these captured. And I said, if the thing be pressed, I think Lee will surrender. Lincoln sees this, and he shoots off a telegram to Grant out on the front, says, let the thing be pressed. And I think this captures succinctly Lincoln's strategy and his belief as commander-in-chief. Let us hit them with our superior forces at multiple places at the same time. And you now have Grant going after Lee's army, not Richmond, but Lee's army. You have Sherman down blowing through the South, through Georgia, and then now by this time working his way up the North Carolina coast. You have Sheridan taking care of the Shenandoah. And really things have gotten to the point where Lee no longer has enough army and has enough of a way to change this battle. So 2 days after Lincoln sends off this, let this thing be pressed, Lee surrenders to Grant on the day that Lincoln is returning to DC. And a week later, Lincoln has been assassinated, ending his term as commander-in-chief. So he never gets to actually be a peacetime president. So with that, I'm going to end, and I'm going to take questions. People that obviously I'll do a pitch for my book. This Lincoln, a Man Who Saved America, is already out. It's been out for a while. The Lincoln the Fire Genius comes out in September, and if you go to the Amazon page, you can pre-order it now. And I will stop and end my share screen so I can see everybody. And hopefully we have tons of questions.
Excellent, David. Thank you very much. Are there questions right away before I start to ask a few? Hello?
Yes, sir. I was wondering what sort of leadership lessons of Lincoln could be emulated by executives or political leaders today. What translates specifically? What's universal of Lincoln's leadership?
There is no universal leadership, but having said that, there's actually a book that's out that's called Leadership Lessons from Abraham Lincoln. That is fairly recent. It's on my shelf in that background behind me. You can probably read it off the shelf. It's Philip, totally blanking on the name. Anyway, there is a book called Leadership Lessons from President Lincoln, from Abraham Lincoln. It's actually, there's a couple of them. Lincoln was tough. You have to be careful taking leadership lessons from him. Lincoln was no executive experience when he came in, no administrative experience. He had not been a governor. He had not been in any position where he had to lead an organization, the administrator, the CEO type position. So he was, on a learning curve for that. He was also on a learning curve for his military experience. He didn't have any of that either. So when you look at somebody like Lincoln and think, well, how did they even manage? This guy was, you talk about green, this guy was pretty green when he came in to a presidential type position. But one of the things that Lincoln was, I think, kind of defines Lincoln is that he would listen to a lot of people. He would hear what they had to say. He would absorb it, and then he would roll it around in his head. And he would start to think, well, how does this work? What's the logic of this? He would really think through it logically. He would look at things like the advantages and disadvantages, the pros and the cons. He would do all of that in his head. And I think Carol put up Don Phillips as the author of that book that I was referring to. So he would do all of that. And then he would, after thinking about it deeply, he would come to a solution that he felt was the right path forward. And then he would implement that. So he wasn't somebody that would stick his finger to the wind and say, well, what do the polls say? He was very cognizant of public sentiment, but not so much to see, well, if the public says that I should do this, because of a poll, which they didn't have polls back then, but, because of a poll, that's what I'm going to do. Not so much because of that. He wanted to know where the public was so that he could guide them into going in his direction. He did that as well with generals, kind of get them to move in the direction that he wanted to go. He did that with political people. he did a lot of things to try to get people to do and move in the direction that he wanted to go to. When you think of it early on, you had these political generals. He needed to keep the Republican Party, which was different factions. There was a radical faction, the far left Republican Party, the Bernie Sanders wing of the Republican Party at the time. And then there was the moderate part of the Republican Party. And then you had less differences in the Conservative Party, the Democrats at the time, because the more radical or right-wingers had already left and gone to the South. But you still had differences. You had Unionists in the Democratic Party, and you had Copperheads who were very much interested in just like, let's just end the war and let them go. So all of these disparate factions, not only with Congress and with everybody else, but in his own cabinet, these made it difficult to get things done. So he would absorb information from all those different ways, make a decision, and then he would work to guide people towards where he thought was the right direction. He wasn't always successful, but he did that. I think that's a pretty good lesson. You don't dictate so much as you get in all the information, you make sense of it, and you try to pick the path forward, and then you help people get there with different motivations for how they move forward.
David, I think the best book I read on this subject is called Tried by War by James McPherson, which is basically a book just on Lincoln as Commander-in-Chief. I don't know if you've read that book in preparation for this. It's really great summary of basically of Lincoln's, what he did. And what he does is he also emphasizes how he used his legal background as Commander-in-Chief, sort of going beyond constitutional powers.
Yeah. Absolutely. That book, Trial by Fire, by McPherson, that's an excellent book that really digs into Lincoln. There are probably 100 books that look at Lincoln as in the sense of Commander-in-Chief and his leadership style as president. There's 16,000 books out there. Obviously, there are at least 100 that talk about him as a Commander-in-Chief and as a leader. It was hard. You're constantly battling people who have different views, and they're not always working towards the same goals. You had problems early in the war. I mentioned early on that at Fort Sumter, he was like, I'm going to get them supplies and food. He has in mind what he wants to do. And then there's a lot of miscommunication between him and Seward and Wells and Montgomery Meigs and a few other people about which ships are bringing supplies down and where the ships are going and not going. And there's some question about whether Seward was saying, well, forget what Lincoln said. This is what I'm saying. Do what I say. He was still in his I'm the prime minister mode. So there were a lot of difficulties. When you have a team of rivals, as Doris Kearns Goodwin says, there's a lot of, you have to be a pretty good leader to make all of that work, because it could fall apart very quickly. But McPherson's book is very good. I recommend that as well.
Oops. Can't hear you, Scott. Can't hear you.
Who's talking?
Scott Schroeder is speaking, but
Scott? I don't even see Scott.
Better use the chat box, Scott. We can't hear you.
I don't even see him on the screen. I want to hear Scott's question.
Gonna put it in the chat box. Yeah, it is interesting that there's a lost cause narrative too, which doesn't say much about Lincoln. attributes him as being a genius for the way he backed the South into starting the war by starting a fireman.
You know, I'm not real big on calling people geniuses. And I think that, you know, Lincoln struggled a lot. I mean, we tend to talk in absolutes and say, well, Lincoln was great. You know, these were his strong points, and he was able to lead all these people with different viewpoints and keep everybody together in the North towards a common goal. But he was struggling, and he made some mistakes. He obviously didn't know what he was doing when he went in there. Most presidents don't know what they're doing when he went in there, but he didn't have any CEO experience or governor experience. So he definitely struggled, and he made some mistakes. You know, he was not necessarily being fair to some of his generals early on. There were a lot of people, not just Lincoln, there were a lot of people who really faulted McClellan for the Peninsula Campaign, and I think McClellan deserves a lot of fault for the Peninsula Campaign. But the Peninsula Campaign just happened to be really lousy weather. It was raining the whole time. It was mired in mud the whole time. He was slow in part because of that. So not everybody is exactly absolute one way or the other. And Lincoln did have some problems. And I'm hoping Scott can come back on again.
He's rewired and ready to go. Scott.
You guys hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, good. Backup equipment. It always is good for stuff like this. So my question was, you know, you had mentioned Lincoln obviously was commander in chief, but he still had his other presidential duties and the politics, as you talked about last time, of the presidency to deal with. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on how Lincoln balanced the two, from the sense that he was getting political pressure to name political generals, not necessarily, but that they kind of had to coexist, the political and the military.
Yeah. Let me address the second half of that first, the political general idea. There were some good political generals and there were some bad political generals. There were some good professional generals and bad professional generals. So being a political general didn't necessarily mean you were the bad guy. You were bad at being a general. But it was critical that Lincoln brought in these, what we call political generals. I mean, he was just filling out the general rank, and you had to have people who were willing to be a general in the first place, but also could pull together, you know, a regiment, you know, could pull together these soldiers. Remember, this wasn't just like you're going to hire a general and then here's your soldiers. A lot of these people were militia, and they were being raised by, excuse me, they were being raised by influential people back home. Some of these, there was, I know now that I want the name, I'm going to draw a blank on it, but there was a governor who fought in, I think, in Bull Run, who raised his own regiment, and he led the fight, a sitting governor. And, you know, you had a lot of different people coming in that would bring, you know, they would raise their own armies. A lot of these people, again, were militia, and some of them became active, you know, full army. I'm not actually sure how many, what the number was of the total number of professional U.S. Army was at the end. But in any case, there were a lot of different people. But as far as the balancing of all of that, the balancing the political generals, and balancing the politics with the military, obviously you have it. Balance isn't maybe the right word. Maybe juggle is the right word. You need to keep all of these things going at once, and they are all interrelated. The Emancipation Proclamation is probably a good example of that. You know, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation as a military order. It's a military necessity that gave him the authority, the constitutional authority, at least in his mind. There are some people who disagree, but gave him the constitutional authority to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. So that's how it's issued, as a military order. And then also, in order to stay within the mandate of the Constitution, kept within this federal consensus that the federal government can't do anything to eliminate slavery in the states at which it exists. So he's saying, okay, all these border states that have slavery, I can't touch it. So I need to exclude all of those from the Emancipation Proclamation. And then there were, and the only ones I could say, well, you are thenceforward and forever free, were the states that were in rebellion. There were insurrection states. Then he could order it because in times of insurrection is in the Constitution, and he interpreted it as such. But there were also sections of states, like parts of Tennessee, that were under Union control. And he even deemed those areas to be, well, that's close to a state. And, you know, it counts as a state. They didn't leave the Union. They're not part of the insurrection, so I can't touch slavery where that is. That's all political calculus to be able to make sure that he doesn't lose the Democrats in particular, but even people in his own party who insist that he abide by the constitutional laws and the laws of that Congress has passed. So it's all very much interwoven, and you really can't separate it. And you know, going back to the question of leadership, that really is a big part of leadership, is being able to interweave all of these different issues and make some sense about it. And that's why I mentioned, one more thing and then I'll stop talking. But I mentioned earlier on that when Halleck was chief of staff, general in chief, sorry, when Halleck was general in chief, Lincoln was effectively acting as his own general in chief in at least some ways.
Oh, Jesus.
Okay, so Lincoln is acting as his own general in chief. Well, it's general in chief is a military responsibility, and you know the old phrase, like if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Well, if you're a general, everything looks like it's something that needs to be bombed. This is why you have a civilian as the commander in chief, as the president. That's why you have a civilian as the Secretary of Defense now. Because you need to bring in all of those political aspects and interweave them with the realities of military life and running the war.
David, how do you assess Lincoln's ability to assess technology as a key part of his job, Commander-in-Chief?
Well, you know, I'm obviously a big fan of Lincoln and his technology interests. He was good and bad for the war effort in that sense. Everybody knew that if the Army and the Navy turned him down, and if Ripley, the ordnance chief, turned him down, that all they had to do was walk into the White House carrying their new weapon, walk in the front door, walk upstairs and sit down in Lincoln's outer office and say, I want to talk to the president about this great new invention I have. So he was very willing to listen to these people. And there were some nutty people that came up there and came up with some really nutty ideas. There were also some really good ideas. And Lincoln, as I mentioned, he would test some of these ideas. Some of these were just, it may seem like a good idea, and when we look at it from our standpoint now, it's like, oh yeah, a machine gun that can fire many rounds very quickly. That's a great thing. Oh, boy, I wish they had that in the Civil War. Well, the problem with that is you got a lot of different, you know, the coffee mill gun and the Gatling guns had multiple barrels, and you shoot multiple bullets, and one of them was flat and the other was round and turned, and you had a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of pieces that could go wrong. They were heavy. You had to transport them. You had to train people. Logistically, it's kind of a nightmare to have all of those options and then to keep them fed. So I can understand from Ripley's point of view. On the other hand, they were really the monitor. Erickson and the Navy had a major beef years before, and they weren't talking to each other. And if Lincoln hadn't stepped in, and if there wasn't a third party that came in and kind of got all of the parties into Lincoln's office, somewhat without telling all these people that there were also the other side was going to be there, it may never have happened. And the ironclads became a major force in the war, not just that the one Monitor versus Merrimack that we all know about, but monitors and ironclads became very important, especially in Mississippi and in the rivers and in the bays. They weren't so great out in the ocean. In fact, the Monitor itself sank when they were trying to tow it down to North Carolina after this. But they were very important in the rivers. And some of the other technologies became very important. Railroads became very important. I mentioned that there were a lot more railroad miles in the north than in the south. There were a lot more built during the Civil War. And Herman Haupt, who is an engineer that focused on railroads, I think some of these people that are really into railroads and really into military technology and really into the Civil War probably know about him, but a lot of the public never heard about him, and yet he's one of the more important people in the war effort. So Lincoln was good and bad for that, but a lot of these things wouldn't have been put into force if Lincoln hadn't been pushing it.
Ed?
Ed Steers, yeah.
You're muted, Ed.
Can you hear me now? I didn't realize I was
Yes.
muted again.
Yes, we
I
can.
said, speaking of political calculus, one of the strangest and perhaps little known policies of Lincoln in the second half of the war was trading with the enemy. I don't know how much you're aware of that, but he actually had a policy of sending agents in the South, what was called pork for cotton. And it lasted for quite a while and was quite controversial. I just wondered if you had ever gotten into that and what your thoughts were, whether this was a crazy policy or whether there was some sanity to it.
I'm going to say that there's a great book that's out by Dr. Edward Steers, and he has a chapter in there that deals with the trading with the enemy concept.
You mean this book?
That book. What a great book that is.
What is that cheap?
No,
I'm embarrassed.
I'm being serious. So I mean, Ed does tackle that issue in his book, and it's Getting Right with Lincoln is the name of the book. And he deals with a lot of other issues that are controversial, or there's differences of opinion amongst historians, and does a great job teasing all of those out. So I will highlight that book. As far as my answer to it, it's not an area that I've spent much time thinking about because it just isn't an area that I've spent much time thinking about it. Of the 15 to 20 different things that I researched about Lincoln, that's not one of them. So I don't really know that much about it. Whether it's a good or a bad policy, I think I know enough to know that there were merits to it. There are also some, conflicts of interest issues that are problematic. So,
Well, a lot of millionaires were made.
Yes, there were, and anybody wants to read more about that, I would say to go to Ed Steers' book. I will, before anybody else asks a question, Rachel Riley has put in the chat, when I was scrambling earlier to try to figure out who that sitting governor was, she said the Governor William Sprague IV of Rhode Island fought in the first battle of Bull Run. And if I recall correctly, doesn't William Sprague IV get married to Kate Chase? Is that right? A couple of people giving me the thumbs up.
You are correct, David. You're correct.
Okay, so we have confirmation. So this guy is the sitting governor of Rhode Island, and he fights as a
divorce, but yeah.
he leads forces into battle at Bull Run. And he obviously survived because he ends up marrying Salmon P. Chase's daughter. and becoming probably one of the more influential tandem families in the country. Any other
David, you-
questions or comments or corrections?
You had said that Bull Run was an eye opener for Lincoln. What were the lessons of that first Bull Run?
I think Lincoln realized in Bull Run that I think that was when he realized how much he doesn't know. He was very much a, I see the path forward, let's just implement it. And he would see, and part of this was, to be honest, was because of people, well, McDowell to some extent, but later on, especially from McClellan, but there were others. He would say, you're saying that we're having trouble because it's muddy and it's rainy. It's like, well, the other side is moving and they have the same mud and the same rain. Why can't you do it? So he was very much, if they can do it, why can't we? They're green, we're green, they're all green alike. But he did, I think, and everybody, to be honest, it's not just Lincoln, everybody realized after the first Bull Run, this wasn't going to be the quick, we go out and we do a show of force and everybody runs away. And then we come back to the table and negotiate. Everybody, all the seceded states coming back into the Union, which is what the North wanted. This is going to have to be a fighting war, and a long drawn out fighting war, which any real war tends to be, is going to be problematic. The South was not going to come back. Those states that seceded, they were not going to say, yeah, we were just kidding. We're going to come back and be there and we'll have slavery protected. They had that anyway. If they had stayed in the Union, they would have had slavery protected. The problem was, as they saw, and see if I can find my sheet here. The problem is that the South saw what Lincoln saw and what even Stephen A. Douglas saw and had been telling the South prior to the election and prior to the war. At the beginning of the war, I mentioned that there were 19 free states and 15 slave states. But 4 of those slave states were part of the Union. So it was really 23 Union states to 11 Confederate states. By the end of the war, you had Nevada that came in as a free state in 1864, just before the election. West Virginia had come in 1863, and by soon after, you got rid of slavery. Also, as the end of the war showed up, you had factions in Arkansas, Louisiana, Tennessee, Maryland, Missouri, that Lincoln at least declared as representing those states and passing new laws, new constitutions, and saying, we're going to come back into the Union, and we'll accept the fact that we won't have slavery, and we'll put it in our Constitution. So there were quite a few free states and hardly any slave states left by the end of the war, even if they had tried to come back together. And the slave states, they knew that. They knew that they weren't coming back, and they were out to stay apart. We're going to separate ourselves. We're going to be a slave country. And after we separate ourselves successfully, we're going to take over Cuba and maybe Jamaica and maybe Colombia and Colombia and what is now Panama and, that whole Caribbean rim. We'll take all of those and we'll make those slaves, because they were already slave, except for places like Haiti where there had been an uprising, but all of those places all had slavery as much as we did and more. So it would have been easy to just say, okay, you're part of us now. So I think you had as irreconcilable differences that there was no way they were ever going to get back together. And so Lincoln realized that, I think at that time, and others did, and they realized we need to think about our strategy. How are we going to do this? It's not just one battle. It's going to take putting all of our forces at this, as many places as we can, all at the same time, and let's just use our advantage to overwhelm them. It's like, what's the phrase they use now? The shock and awe. let's get them all. So I think that's something that he learned. And then he started looking for people that could implement that. And there was difficulty in doing that. And it was complicated by the fact that while Lincoln had a good theoretical idea of what to do, he didn't have the field experience to understand the logistics of how all of that would happen. And that was a complicating factor for some of these generals.
Anybody else? There was an active sub chat going on in the chat box about Mary Lincoln.
About who? Like Mary Lincoln?
About Mary Lincoln, yes. That was
Okay.
quite a bit of interest in her ability to upset things.
Yeah, I guess I'll mention Mary Lincoln in the sense that she obviously was a factor as well. I mean, you mentioned talk about political and the military. They lost Willie Lincoln in early 1862. And they were friends of the Lincolns who died, relatives of Mary Lincoln that were fighting for the South who died. There was a lot of personal angst, and especially after Willie, Mary Lincoln, who had plenty of issues of her own, was very distraught, and her life basically spiraled downhill after that with reasons. I saw somebody mentioned Burlingame's An American Marriage book. I haven't read it yet. I've heard a lot about it. I will read it shortly. But there are plenty of other books that talk about Lincoln and the marriage that have different points of view. But clearly, here's a man who is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. He's president of the United States. He's got all of this political stuff going on. He has all this military stuff going on. And then he has to deal with all of the family issues. And of course, all of us have the same thing, but we're not president of the United States during a war. So when next time you have a little argument with your spouse, you might want to think yourself lucky that you're not part of the Civil War. So there are all a lot of things, and you have to give a lot of credit to presidents both then and now. I mean, Lincoln's the only one that had to deal with the Civil War, but we've been through a lot, and I give a lot of deference to sitting presidents these days, even when some of them are crazy.
Carol Johnston has an observation.
Yeah, it is an observation going back to earlier you mentioned that a lot of people regarded Grant as something of a butcher. And I just wanted to comment that I was very struck when I read an account of when Grant took over the Army of the Potomac. And I forget exactly what the situation was, but a lot of the troops had been used to there had been a defeat, and a lot of the troops were used to marching back to Washington to regroup. And when instead Grant gave the order to keep going, they cheered. They knew that there was going to be terrible casualties, but they were so committed to and so tired of constantly getting hauled back and not making any progress that they were willing, which I thought said a lot about the caliber of the Union rank and file.
Yeah, and I think it was Sherman later on who said that, war, I don't know if I'm quoting him or Patton, but it's like war is a terrible thing. It's good that people understand how horrible war is.
Actually, that was Lee.
Was that Lee? Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm totally misquoting
he said
who
it is
said
well
it,
that war is so terrible, otherwise we should grow too fond of it.
Okay, I think I was thinking somebody else said something similar, but yeah. I mean, you want to know how horrible it is, and I'll bring in one more thing that relates
David,
to that.
what Sherman said is war. He said, "I'll tell you, boys, war is all hell." That's what Sherman said.
Yeah, I'll bring in one more thing that relates to that. How horrible war is, and it relates to technology, and not so much Lincoln, although he did sit for Alexander Gardner quite a bit. Alexander Gardner and Brady and others, they took a lot of pictures in the field. always after the battle, because you had long exposure times for the photography at the time. But they started, showing these pictures of soldiers, dead soldiers in the field. And this is the first time that people could see how horrible war was. War is easy to romance when you're talking about all this fighting with valor and you never have to see any blood. But when you start to see dead people and people with their piles of amputated limbs, it really comes home to you. And I think that the photographers starring the Civil War did as much as some of the soldiers to really bring home the idea that this was horrible. It was very, very difficult for soldiers and for their families back home who would lose their entire families, and usually the breadwinners. Remember, women weren't working out there in the workforce, and although they were taking care of the farms back home usually. And I shouldn't say that women weren't in the workforce, because there were quite a few women that did work in the workforce, just like they did in World War II, which became much more prevalent. So there were a lot of things going on.
We have time for one more question.
Or not.
If not, David, Kent, thank you very much. Excellent presentation. I think I enjoyed that.
Thank you.
I will let you know as a group that our last of this four-part series will be next Thursday at the same time. Past President John O'Brien will talk about Lincoln's legacy and why we continue to honor that great man. I would encourage you, if you get a chance, I'm going to do that covering 5 different speeches that Lincoln gave. If you would be able to look at his Lyceum address of 1838 or his House Divided speech of 1858, it would be helpful for our conversation. So again, David, thank you very much. We'll conclude today's session with my thanks and appreciation for your participation and attendance today. I look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you and good night.